Japan never believed the numbers. Even in the early months of the Pacific War, Japanese naval intelligence analysts looked at American production claims and simply dismissed them. A destroyer escort in 4 to 6 weeks, entire classes of warships built faster than Japan could repair battle damage. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, it sounded like intentional deception, an American bluff meant to intimidate a fleet forged through decades of elite training and a culture of martial superiority. But a bluff has limits. A bluff doesn't keep showing up on the horizon in steel. The truth was far stranger to the Japanese mindset. America was turning shipbuilding into an assembly line. What Henry Ford had done to the automobile, the United States was about to do to the sea. And it was this industrial transformation, not a tactical trick or a brilliant admiral, that would eventually overwhelm Japan's proud navy, even before the battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf made the outcome unmistakable. It began quietly, far from any shipyard, inside conferences between naval planners, engineers, and industrialists who understood a brutal equation. The U.S. Navy needed hundreds of new ships, fast. Not heavy cruisers, not battleships. It needed smaller ships, destroyer escorts, to protect convoys, hunt submarines, screen invasion fleets, and fill the endless, hungry demand for hulls in the water. German U-boats were killing merchant ships at a rate the Navy couldn't match. Japanese submarines and aircraft posed the same threat across the Pacific. The oceans were too big, the needs too many. The traditional craft of shipbuilding, slow, specialized, artisanal, couldn't keep up. So the Navy made a decision that would reshape the maritime world. It would mass-produce warships the same way America mass-produced cars, planes, and weapons. The destroyer escort became the perfect candidate. Small, simple, rugged, and designed from the start for modular assembly. A hull in one yard, deck sections in another, engine rooms manufactured like giant Lego blocks ready to be dropped into place. And above all, welding instead of riveting. Riveting required armies of craftsmen. Welding required training, discipline, and time, but it could be done by thousands of newly recruited workers, men unfit for combat, women entering industrial work for the first time, teenagers graduating from welding schools set up overnight. Among the yards that embraced this new world was an unlikely one, Brown Shipbuilding in Houston, Texas. Before the war, the Brown brothers had never built a ship. They were in construction, not naval architecture. But the Navy didn't want tradition, it wanted output. And the Brown brothers had land, organization, and the willingness to reinvent themselves industrial speed. In 1942, the Navy handed them contracts for ships they had never built and expected them to deliver on impossible deadlines. They did more than deliver. They shattered expectations so thoroughly that naval observers visiting Houston wrote reports describing the yard as a miracle in real time. Destroyer escorts began gliding into the water in weeks, not months, their hulls welded from prefabricated modules arriving on flatbed trucks from factories spread across Texas. Sections dropped into place like puzzle pieces. Welding crews worked around the clock under arc-light glare that turned midnight into noon. Every step of the job was timed, measured, and broken into repeatable tasks, exactly what Japanese naval planners believed could not be done with warships. For Japan, shipbuilding remained a matter of artisanship, slower, but with a sense of pride and precision. A destroyer or cruiser built at Kure or Yokosuka was a masterpiece, riveted, hand-shaped, overseen by craftsmen who had inherited their skills through generations. This tradition produced excellent ships, but it could not generate volume. And volume, in industrial war, becomes its own kind of weapon. When the first waves of American destroyer escorts reached the Pacific, Japanese intelligence couldn't understand where they were coming from. The number of new hulls appearing in convoy screens, anti-submarine patrols, and amphibious operations simply didn't make sense. Even if America was building ships faster, how could the rate be this high? Reports arrived claiming that certain yards, including several that had never even existed before the war, were launching ships every few weeks. Japanese officers dismissed the figures as exaggeration or propaganda. No nation could build a warship with the speed of consumer goods. But the U.S. wasn't just building ships, it was building a system that built ships. The difference was enormous. Factories across the continent were being refitted to produce ship modules like aircraft wings or tank hulls. Rail networks became arteries feeding shipyards. Welding schools put tens of thousands of new workers into helmets and gloves within months. And the philosophy of interchangeable sections meant that a shortage in one factory didn't halt the entire ship. Another plant could pick up the slack. The United States had unlocked a kind of industrial fluidity that Japan could neither comprehend nor match. By late 1943, the results became visible in combat. Convoys that had once been vulnerable now traveled with screens of destroyer escorts jamming sonar pings into the deep. Japanese submarines operating in the Central Pacific reported increasing difficulty conducting attacks without being chased off by the new American escorts. At first, Japanese captains assumed they were seeing the same ships repeatedly. Only later did they realize that new hull numbers kept appearing, numbers they had never seen before, numbers increasing at a pace that defied their estimates. Then came the turning point. The major carrier battles of 1944. The U.S. Navy had grown so large that it could launch operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. Every task force, every invasion fleet, every logistics convoy now traveled under the protection of more escorts than Japan had submarines. Destroyer escorts screened the replenishment groups that fueled the fast carriers at sea, allowing American naval aviation to operate far from bases with uninterrupted tempo. This alone transformed the strategic calculus of the Pacific War. Japan's elite naval aviators were formidable, but they couldn't strike fuel tankers that never sailed unguarded. And behind all of this, behind the great battles of the Philippine Sea, the Marianas, the Formosa raids, stood the overlooked miracle of the home front. Factories, welding schools, modular construction lines, and yards like Brown Shipbuilding producing at a pace that broke every precedent in naval history. The ultimate proof arrived at Leyte Gulf. When Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force entered the Surigao Strait, they met not just the firepower of American battleships and cruisers, but the overwhelming presence of escort forces that had only recently existed on blueprints. Destroyer escorts and destroyers lined the strait, launching torpedo attacks that disrupted the Japanese advance before it ever reached the main battle line. In the larger context of Leyte Gulf, American escorts screened the transport ships, guarded the invasion beaches, and ensured the logistical backbone of the operation remained intact. The Japanese High Command, reviewing reports afterward, saw hull numbers they didn't recognize, ships that hadn't existed mere months earlier. By 1945, the scale of American shipbuilding was undeniable. Brown Shipbuilding alone delivered dozens of destroyer escorts, each built in a fraction of the time Japan required for a single comparable vessel. Nationwide, the U.S. built over 500 destroyer escorts, an industrial tsunami that Japan could neither predict nor resist. An entire arm of the American fleet had materialized almost out of thin air, born not from naval tradition, but from mathematical efficiency. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war believing that skill would overcome size, that elite warriors would defeat mass production. Their naval officers studied Meihan, believed in the decisive battle, and placed faith in the fighting spirit of their sailors. What they hadn't accounted for was a different kind of power. A power measured not in guns or armor, but in welding torches, factory shifts, and conveyor belts of steel. The shock came too late. Even after recognizing the scale of American production, Japan had no means to respond. They lacked the industrial depth, the raw materials, the oil, and the logistical infrastructure to replicate what the U.S. was doing. And so they watched, helplessly, as convoy after convoy, task force after task force, carrier group after carrier group appeared with fresh escorts, ships that seemed to multiply on the ocean like an industrial illusion. America was not lying. It was building. Building with a purpose, with a system, with a national will that had transformed civilians into welders and landlocked factories into ship part foundries. Building with a speed that rewrote the realities of naval warfare. In the end, the story of how America overwhelmed the Imperial Japanese Navy is not just about battles. It is not just about admirals or strategy. It is about industrial imagination. The ability to take a process that had always been slow and turn it into something fast, predictable, and limitless. It is about turning the chaos of war into a rhythm of production, where every day meant another hull sliding into the water, another ship steaming toward a distant ocean where sailors needed it. Japan thought America was lying about building destroyers in 4 weeks, until they kept arriving. And when they arrived, they didn't come alone. They came as part of a tidal wave of steel that changed the course of the Pacific War, proving that in the modern age, industry itself becomes a battlefield where welders, not warriors, sometimes determine the fate of fleets.